Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Ghostbusters Dose, Ghostbusters 2, the movie with slime and Slimer. Bigger, badder, and slimier, I guess. But anyways, going into this sequel movie, I would probably want to review this film just because I feel like this film is a New Year's film. Recently, there's very few movies that ultimately have that kind of tag to it. Ultimately, you could probably say maybe Forrest Gump or like some other movies that have to have like a New Year's party or something in it. But rarely do you have it to where it's like a real New Year's movie. Uh, I feel like this movie is questionably a New Year's film because ultimately you have them trying to bust a ghost while New Year's is going on. Reasonably, I love this movie. I ultimately, there's a lot of people that feel differently about this film, just because reasonably it's not as good as the first one, or reasonably there might be people that are just like, yeah, I don't like the execution, I don't like the story, I don't like that there's too much story and not enough ghost busting. Like, I don't like that, like, we have it to where we have to forcibly do that sequel trope of, oh, time has passed from the first film. Oh, wow, that's great. Like, so many people probably have gripes about this film. So many people have, like, issues with it. Or ultimately, some people might have thought that the Vigo the Carpathian ghost, if what I have that ultimately that might have been a goofy concept. You have a Fabio-ish guy who is just coming out of a painting and just like, meh, that's not scary enough, and so on and so forth. Uh, Reasonably, the complaint could easily be that, and I'd be okay with it, because we ultimately when looking at it, we got freaking Ghostbusters that did a comic book. And ultimately, they would talk about Janish and Vigo the Carpathian, and ultimately they would just go wild with that. So yeah, when looking at it, if the movie didn't do anything good enough justice, ultimately the comic books went on with these ideas and made something interesting out of them. So when looking at it, it's like if any complaints of anything that anyone had about whatever, it's just like, well, hey, just check out the comic books. Uh, Check out the stories and see what they did with them because the comic books made any number of any of these things way more interesting that they ended up being in the movies. So when looking at it, I think people need to go and check out the comic books, the IMDb books, because recently they're freaking amazing. Like I enjoyed all of those stories. Um, anyways, Ghostbusters 2, yeah, there is kind of a little bit of something there for everybody when looking at it. This movie is much more of a variety movie where I think in the first one they kind of just like they really focus much more on the ghost busting, and they kind of like you could kind of tell like the first movie is a lot more choppy. There's a lot of uh like it feels like in the first movie they wanted to get like certain things accomplished, where in like this movie I feel like they were just like, hey man, the first one was so great, how about we just give them a wider variety in here. And so it kind of like you can say also too that this movie was a little bit more choppy, but it was kind of like choppy with like them going, okay, we're gonna do this whole segment that might not mean anything for the rest of the movie, but uh, there's just gonna be this scene that kind of transitions us to why that scene was important. So like the whole world of the psychics thing probably wasn't like an important piece, but it was just to transition us into the rest of the movie or to just transition us into meeting a character that ultimately would become important. Uh, when looking at this, probably I guess I could probably look at IMDb for like maybe one or two other people, because ultimately I might not remember their names. But when looking at it, I just don't care. It's like I've seen these movies numerous times. As ultimately, I'll just kind of talk my way into ultimately people understanding any number of things. So going into here, yeah, I'm not doing this with a safety net. When I did Ghostbusters 1, I probably had that out to just see the cast, but ultimately I didn't need to know any of the names. Like, dude, I've seen this movie I don't know how many times. Uh yeah, because we have Janusz Poha, which ultimately plays the quasi henchman of the actual villain in this story. We of course have Vigo the Carpathian, the Scourge of Carpathia, the Sorrow of Moldavia, I believe. The Scourge of Carpathia, the Sorrow of Moldavia. Sure, command me, Lord. Uh, but yeah, so reasonably, a lot of times people would probably compare Velvet Buzzsaw with this movie. Not that there's anything wrong with Velvet Buzzsaw or this film. I've seen Velvet Buzzsaw and I actually like that film. The only thing is there is no ghost busting that is being done within that film. There is no real, true, like, seemingly I think absolute resolution in that movie. Like it just goes off into just like, well, everybody is effed, so sucks to be them because they're all gonna die. And so yeah, like that's what just kind of crappingly happens with that film. Um, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy that film. Uh, but anyways, going on into Ghostbusters 2, we have to where, of course, a painting becomes alive in this film. So it almost has like that almost quasi night in the museum kind of thing going on with it. But if anything, really, we don't really quite understand exactly why that this painting is absurdly coming to life. But we have it to where ultimately we kind of see this like slowly but surely turn. Where ultimately, at first, we have Sigourney Weaver's character that ultimately like every once in a while it looks at me and it winks at me and I'm weird. It's like I'm uncomfortable with it, and so ultimately they have to like look into the painting a little bit more, and they have to research it and PKE meter it and all this kinds of other stuff to eventually have us just to be ultimately realizing that like, well, we're gonna have to do some more testing and then eventually get to this. But the real thing is really just pushing the fact that seemingly somebody wants this baby. And bizarrely, they have to pick a baby that is named after a hot dog. That poor kid. And that poor kid. And so ultimately, we have points where we have within this movie, and I just don't understand why, but it's there. I don't quite understand why we had to have a baby in this film. Like, I guess there was a lot of funny or joking moments, but when looking at it, I just didn't quite understand why they. Like, if you kind of take the baby out, you could probably come up with any number of any other reasons uh, to not have to have the baby. You could have had any number of things in there instead. You could have had Vigo be anybody instead of just a child, but I don't know. I guess it's kind of the child's play defense, where ultimately you just really need a younger kid to eventually be turned into Vigo. The only thing is, it's just like, okay, well, how is Vigo going to be able to be this baby and be so powerful? Anyways, just it is what it is. Uh, but anyways, so going to this movie, I guess you could ultimately break it down that ultimately Vigo has control of the river of slime, and so reasonably he could ultimately control the ghosts that come out of it, and so reasonably he could via proxy like be protected by the ghosts, so ultimately he could live till he's a bajillion years old. But the Ghostbusters are the only thing that are kind of putting the boots to that or trying to like conflict with that. Um, but if anything, yeah, I can also say that there is a little bit more variety in this movie, but there also is that kind of same old move that they kind of go with the first one, where they kind of go with this one as well. The whole mayor thing, when dude, they're copying from the first one, like basically copy and paste. But as per usual, you have to get like you kind of have to get it to where reasonably they kind of go through the same motions, because really when looking at it, there always has to be through every one of these movies like a very huge and or cosmic event going on, and to where ultimately the government and or the mayor has to get involved. But to me, the second time around, I was like, you didn't have to go through the ways in which they kind of go in here to ultimately have them committed, and and to kind of approach this of just like, well, yeah, we're just gonna like go and in this same exact route again, just to have it be like, okay, well, uh, Lenny, big man, we're gonna need your help again, and ultimately, like we have in this sequel movie, they're really taking full advantage of this help from the government, and ultimately calling upon a very French lady at some points in this movie. So, if they don't ask the Scalilli brothers, before all that. But anyways, let's go into talking about this film and ultimately kind of break it down from what all I remember. This movie is a little bit harder to break down because ultimately there's a lot of moving parts going on in this film. There's a lot of points of which that I feel like, yeah, I'm going to say it this way, and ultimately didn't go exactly that way in this film. Um, but when looking at it, it's just like there's a wider amount of things going on in this film, and probably it's just going to be me going over some parts of this film, and probably a lot of people who've probably seen Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2 probably just be like, whichever, however way you want to go about it. So let's go about it. Let's bust out the double five to otherwise talk about this film. Some good points that I'll bring up when we talk about it. So, ultimately, the very beginning of this film, we have Sigourney Weaver that is ultimately going throughout the town with her baby, blah, 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 with her baby carriage, ultimately to tell us that there had been some reasonable time from the last film. And so ultimately we have to where this baby carriage ultimately is strolling along to ultimately get hit very barely with some mood slime. And so ultimately we have it to where Sigourney is making her way to her super to ultimately tell this guy about I believe fixing her I want to say I think it's about fixing her air conditioner, uh, or the heater or something, because ultimately it was very cold in in her apartment, and ultimately she needs it fixed because it's very cold in there. And ultimately he's like, well, hey, I'll check it out. So all while Sigourney is ultimately talking to this super about because ultimately the super guy is so busy is ultimately uh talking about to some other guy about check the water, and like checking the water and checking other things. And so reasonably also Sigourney is coming in to have him check uh, water and or the heater and stuff like that. So ultimately it was a little cold in that room. Anyways, so we have the stroller that just starts to roll a little bit, and so ultimately you have Sigourney that is desperately starting to chase after it. We have to where there is a girl on the bike that ultimately freaking just crashes and falls over right in front of the stroller. To where ultimately we have Sigourney running after it, just going, um, ultimately mentioning like, "Hey, my baby!" Just like Shredder and the other Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, baby. Ah, no. Sigourney is like, that's my baby, that's my carriage, and ultimately, so you have it to where uh, people on their bike is getting knocked over. You have cars that are ultimately dodging out of the way of this stroller, so on and so forth, to the point to where ultimately a bus will seemingly stop uh, Sigourney Weaver's child. And so reasonably, you have it to where Sigourney's like, oh my god. So ultimately, she grabs upon her baby and is holding on her baby, and that's when we cue the Ghostbusters 2 soundtrack of sorts. And so we stroll into now having the Ecto 1 just rolling off into going into some birthday party of sorts. So, funny enough, we have the Ghostbusters cracking open their Ghostbuster theme song and dancing to these kids, watching them in utter awe. Because reasonably, we have to where these kids were. I hoped it was gonna be He-Man. And so reasonably, you have the kids all coming in and ultimately saying that the Ghostbusters were frauds, and ultimately that's what their father had told them to say about the Ghostbusters. And because ultimately there was a kid that said like, yeah, like my father said that you guys are frauds and that you're full of crap. And so reasonably the Ghostbusters, so ultimately we have Ray who ultimately just like song. And so uh Winston ends up hitting the music, and so reasonably they go into the theme song Ghostbusters, and ultimately Ray and Winston are dancing around weirdly. I just don't quite understand why, but justifiably because they can't actually do their actual Ghostbuster act anymore, so they're trying to figure out how to make some kind of money. And so reasonably you have the kids that are all saying he men, and like the Ghostbusters like, and it don't look good, and they're like, yeah, like we're just not gonna win these kids over. Like we might as well just get out of here. So ultimately we have it to where Winston is just kind of feeling like this town has kind of just forgotten about them. Reasonably, uh, they had taken down 100 foot Marshmallow Man, and really they just got sued by every county and state in New York. And ultimately, Ray is like, "Well, yeah, what a ride!" But still, like Winston is just kind of feeling very defeated. How like nobody, none of those kids even remember who they are. Ultimately, just kind of like they have had a uh, very quick and very just short shelf life. Ultimately, people have moved on, and so ultimately knowing full well that the Ghostbusters can't actually bust ghosts anymore, because ultimately they are uh, they had been given a paper to cease and desist all Ghostbuster and paranormal activity, and so ultimately they can no longer do that. So, anyways, what is the word? Uh, Restrainment order from uh, from the people, uh, from the mayors and from the government and such to no longer perform any of their acts. So, anyways, we have it to where eventually we push on. Sadly enough, we have to push on from all these interesting events. We have to have it to where seemingly we have Peter who's doing the world of the psychics. Yeah. And so recently it seems that they have two individuals on this show that are ultimately going to tell us when the world is going to end. So ultimately, there is one girl that I believe her name is Elaine. And so Peter ultimately asks, like, what is your date, Elaine? She ultimately says, February 14th, 2013, I think is what she ends up saying. And ultimately, you have Peter that's like, Valentine's Day, bummer. Where'd you get your date, Elaine? She ultimately mentions, like, well, I think my date used some kind of a ray or some mind control device because he ultimately forced me into his room. That's where he told me about the end of the world. So we ultimately have that story, and that pushes us on into the other uh, person that is giving us a date. Uh, I think his name is Walter, or it's Malton, Malter. Anyways, mood point. We ultimately have the guy that is giving us another date, and he says, "I believe the world is gonna end on New Year's Eve." And so ultimately, Peter is like, "Well, uh, shouldn't you have like pushed the date a little bit further than that? Like, shouldn't you have said like, well, the world isn't going to end in 1993. It's going to end in 1994, or I think it's 84, 94. I don't know. I don't remember when this movie came out. But anyways, we have this guy that is ultimately like, well, I have a strong belief the world is going to end on New Year's Eve. And so that's when Peter is just kind of like, well, okay, sure. Uh-huh, sure. But I think the New Year's guy is the first guy, but then ultimately the second one is the girl with the Valentine's Day date. And so reasonably, we have to where Peter have to kind of wrap it up after that, where he's like, well, occasionally you meet a nice man, a star man, an ET, but eventually they come out to be some kind of big lizard. And ultimately, on the next week's segment, they're gonna have hairless pets. Because ultimately, Peter is asking for Ira, which is the cat name. Where ultimately he's like, hairless cats, hairless pets, weird. So And we ultimately have to where he has the send off where he does the weird salute, and so ultimately he goes on to talking to his producer, and he's like, where do you get these people? Like, where do you get these nutballs that come off the street? Where do you get all these people? Ultimately, none of the legitimate psychics are willing to come on his show because he thinks that he's a fraud. And Peter says, I am a fraud. So we ultimately push on to have a person that works with the mayor's office to ultimately be talking to Peter to ultimately talk about that he ultimately jokes around about like, oh yeah, I remember you guys like your publicity hounds and this and that. It's like, if anything, I remember you guys, but I just don't see any ghosts around here. It's like, so Peter is mentioning about the job that he did with the mayor a while back, and ultimately he got stiffed by every bureaucrat and bookworm like himself. And so ultimately he's like, hey, uh, hey, when are you gonna do us a favor? And we ultimately have this guy who is ultimately working for the mayor and is ultimately just giving Bill or Peter much more and more crap, and ultimately he just kind of walks off, and ultimately Peter is just like, hey, like, aren't you supposed to lie to me and kiss my butt? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to kiss my butt. So ultimately knowing full well that like this is another election year coming. So anyways, we have to where pushing on because I can't remember everything that happens in this movie. So we ultimately have it to where we have us needing to have seemingly Sigourney call up Dan and or Ray and Egon to ultimately open up a case on her baby, on her Oscar. And so reasonably we have it to where it seems that both Ray and Egon have opened up a bookshop. So we really have it to where Peter makes his way into the bookstore to ultimately uh, we have it to where both Ray and Egon are kind of being hush hush about this whole Sigourney Weaver's new case or Dana Barrett's new case. And so ultimately, we have a tour. Bill comes in to get his books, to get his book, Magical Paths of Fortune and Power. So Bill ends up picking up his book to ultimately kind of get whatever information is going on for any new cases, any kind of leads, anything. And so ultimately, Ray is like, "Well, yeah, we're working on something from somebody we know." And so Peter's like, "Oh." So, and kind of Egon is kind of like, shh, like hush, hush, like, no, do not mention this to, because we're working on Dana's case. Like, shush, shushola, shushasha. So we ultimately have Egon, who's kind of in the background, just like, nyeh. So we ultimately have it to where we have Peter that ultimately is going to like, oh, so anybody would know, huh? Like, who's that? Like, oh, just somebody we know, just Dana. Like, oh, Dana, and so we have to where eventually Peter just grabs and twists and turns Ray's ears, of course, to eventually squeal like a pig to ultimately mention that it's Dana, it's Dana, it's Dana Barrett. It's like, oh, my Dana Barrett. Oh. So we ultimately have it to where we have seemingly Dana Barrett is now playing the cello. I think she was playing something else previously, but I guess she's trying out the cello. And so recently there is a ding dong at the door, and so we have to where Dana opens it, and shoving right into the door comes Peter, and then basically Ray and Egon afterwards accompanying. To the point where ultimately Ray has to mention it's like he pulled my ears. Like I tried not to tell him, but he pulled my ears. So we have it to where, of course, like Peter has to like be all big and macho. Uh, so really, we have realistically this moment, of course, where like Peter has to kind of confront, of course, uh, Dana about their past and how it didn't work out. Basically, we don't get to the old ball and chain moment, but eventually that happens at some point. So we have it to where uh, we're reasonably. Bill is kind of playing around with Dana's cello, just kind of doing a little jokery around it. And so ultimately, we have to where it pushes on to eventually Ray and Egon testing the baby, ultimately seeing if he's ticklish, and all kinds of other stuff that doesn't quite make any sense. Some ocular responses, so on and so forth. Just kind of like all kinds of real battery of tests that really just don't quite make a lick of anything. Um, because ultimately, before all this, which I quickly pushed on about, because ultimately we had uh, Sigourney, we had Dana's character going to Egon because ultimately he was doing a test upon his own, having seemingly a couple that are going through a divorce, ultimately going and being put through this two-way mirror where ultimately Egon was watching them, and he was testing like mood responses, ultimately telling people that they were going to be waiting like an hour or 2 hours or whatever to see what they would do. And eventually, you just have this one husband of this couple that is just kind of irate and he's throwing his coat and this and that. And then ultimately, you had one study where you had a girl that was getting a puppy. And ultimately, that was like, ooh, this is great. This is awesome. And then so, like, and so Dana was like, "Oh yeah, what a beautiful puppy," and then so eventually, while ultimately uh, Dana is catching up with Egon about Peter, um, and so on and so forth, kind of doing a little catch up. We ultimately have it towards the end of all that. Eventually, after Dana leaves, we have Egon tell his assistant that he's like, "Well, let's see what happens when we take away the puppy." Because ultimately, we have kind of Dana catching up, ultimately talking about this new case where her stroller went kind of horribly awry, and that ultimately, like, she was chasing after it into the streets and ba 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 ba. And then ultimately, like, talking about, like, hey, I want you and Ray on this, but not Peter. He's like, Peter, oh, no, no. I wouldn't think of it. But then ultimately she asks about Peter. It's like, well, how is Peter doing? It's like, ultimately that's when Egon was like, well, he was he was borderline for a while, but then ultimately he crossed the border. Blah 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 blah. Talking a little catch up stuff, but ultimately let's get back to this scene because ultimately there's not much to really push on through there and whichever one have you. But anyways, so there's a lot of crap also to kind of get into here, so we gotta push on eventually. So Oscar with Ray and Egon, ocular tests, ticklish, maybe ticklish. So reasonably, we have it to where reasonably Egon is going to eventually dip into Peter to make him do the stool sample because, of course, he has to get all the samples of such. So, because reasonably, Peter is just like, well, like if anything, there's one thing that I always did good, and that was my job. And so ultimately, we have it to where Peter is just basically asking Egon to like, hey, what are we doing? And it's like, and ultimately Egon's like, well, everything tests good. Everything is good. Everything with the baby is good. Maybe there's something with the crib or like the ultimate or like checking all of the toys and everything like that. Just make sure that like none of the toys are any issue or which are that and whatever have you. But ultimately it leads them to ultimately go to the spot where the baby had stopped. To ultimately they take PKE meters and all kinds of whichever gadgetry to ultimately check on the street, which ultimately the baby had stopped upon. And reasonably, that's where the PKE meters go crazy. And to ultimately, they're like, ho ho ho, like, we got something. So it eventually pushes them on into needing to really go into this sewer and do a deep dive. And so reasonably and irrationally, they end up, the Ghostbusters end up commandeering some construction like worker gear and ultimately making up some story to any number of any people that end up stopping by that they are checking the phone lines. And so reasonably we have it to where eventually a cop pulls over, is like, hey, what are you guys doing? And they ultimately mention it's like, well, we're checking the phone lines. And ultimately the police officers are like, huh, that's kind of weird. Because ultimately the phone lines are over there. And so so what are you actually doing? Why are you guys digging? And while the police officers are desperately trying to come up with these real, true consensuses of what these Ghostbusters are actually doing, we have Ray that is slowly but surely being siphoned down into the sewer. Told to me by accident, he ends up taking a sample of this sludge, but when looking at it, the sludge starts to attack him, and so reasonably he ends up, as quickly as humanly possible, getting rolled back into uh, where the rest of the Ghostbusters are because Ray is starting to freak out because the sludge had started to grab him, and ultimately he's like, hey guys, like there's something wrong with this stuff. It's like, hey, come on, like get me out this hole. And so eventually we have it to where Ray uh, seemingly smashes a part of some portion underground, which ultimately uh, kills power for an entire block. So we ultimately have it to where also in this movie, because we also have to talk about this too. We ultimately have it to where uh, going a little bit into this, uh, we have Dana who is ultimately going into working for Janish Poha as a artist, ultimately to do some restoration, but ultimately she is going to uh, like she's doing it temporary. She's just kind of like she's kind of doing it as a side thing. As soon as her kind of baby gets back up to age or gets to a certain age, she's gonna go back into uh, being with the orchestra full time. So we have it to where seemingly Poha Janusz is ultimately just kind of he's kind of hitting on Dana. Like reasonably, he is just reasonably and irrationally just kind of watching her and trying to see every little thing that she's doing. Uh, Ultimately, kind of like strong arming to for people to kind of do the right things, but when looking at it, like no one listens to Yanish. They just kind of do whatever, and because like no one listens to me, so uh, so we have it to where Yanish goes about his way to ultimately go and take care of his own painting, which ultimately is Vigo the Carpathian, the Sword of the Sword of Carpathia and Sorrow of Madalphia. So we ultimately have it to where Janish is trying to restore this Vigo the Carpathian painting, and it ends up that this painting is end up trying to restore Janish by basically sending seemingly some electricity into Janish, which ultimately gets him to fall down his ladder and to ultimately get youch, ooh, yo, ah. And so, really, that's when Vigo ultimately shows upon himself to ultimately get the control of Janish and to ultimately just like, yeah, you're going to be mine now, you're going to be under my control, so on and so forth. And to ultimately we have to where uh, Janish ultimately is going to try and seduce Dana, but all while doing that, he is also going to see about the baby. So Janish is making his way to the is making his way to Dana, and ultimately he is uh, like, oh hey, like what is all with all this blackness? And so Dana doesn't really quite understand it either, and so ultimately we have it to where Janish is ultimately asking to see like, well, hey, like is your baby okay? Like if anything, like could I come in and like see your baby? Like and to ultimately Dana's like, oh no, he's resting. If anything, like and Janish is like, well, can I just say hello and stuff like that? And ultimately like Dana's like, no, I'm sorry, he's resting. It's like, oh, but I would. It's like it's starting to sound almost like vampirish. It's weird. Um, so recently we have it to where like Janish is trying to seduce Dana, and nothing is really quite working, and so ultimately he's just left to. With his bizarrely lidded eyes, walk through this darkened environment, and it's so bizarre and strange, that whole scene, that doesn't quite make sense to me of what all is actually going on. When you have like all of a sudden Janish's eyes is just like his eyes are like lighted up, and I don't quite understand why. Uh, After meeting Dana, so pushing on, we have it to where ultimately leaning to these guys, these construction workers who are as the Ghostbusters, had got arrested at night. And so, reasonably while had gotten arrested, they ended up in court because ultimately they had collected some sludge. And so, reasonably, we have it to where uh, they have to rely on Lewis Tully to ultimately get him out of this whole snag. And basically, they are pretty much up against the worst possible judge, as well as being against the people of the mayor's persuasion, because we have this girl that seems to be working with the guy that Peter had told him, like, shouldn't you be kissing my butt, like that guy. Ultimately, it seems like that this guy that's ultimately working with the mayor is ultimately going to try to put these guys away for a very long time. And ultimately, the prosecutor is ultimately like, well, with these lists of charges, wouldn't take so long. Won't be so hard. So we ultimately bizarrely have to go into the stretch of having like witnesses and all kinds of stuff come in to try to push this case. But ultimately, when looking at it, the Ghostbusters have the worst judge. They ultimately have this judge that ultimately is called the Hammer. And so reasonably, this judge isn't going to do him any favors. So reasonably, we have it to where ultimately we have Lewis, who really just sucks at being a lawyer because ultimately he got his degree in night school, and and so ultimately that is where we find out the Ghostbusters were arrested at night. So reasonably, like, Lewis is thinking that he's gonna have his other lawyer do him any favors, the other lawyer that's against him, and it's like, no. So reasonably, we have it to where we have to have Peter that is going to be put onto the witness stand and raise his right hand and so on and so forth. So we ultimately have it uh, to where both sides of the prosecution ends up getting their time with Peter, and reasonably we have it to where like Lewis doesn't really have any legitimate questions, and so really we have like Lewis come in there first, and he's like, well, you wouldn't have done any malice or like uh any hardship or any like, it was one thing, it was a one shot deal. And objection, your honor, he's leading the witness. So we ultimately have it to where like Peter is just telling the judge, it's like, dude, he doesn't have any questions. It's like, dude, we've tried to help him out enough already. It's like there's nothing that we have to really help him like do any like number of things to. And ultimately, we funnily enough, have Lewis tell uh tell people, it's like, yeah, like ultimately they like, I turned to a dog once and they helped me. That's his only defense, is like, yeah, I turned to a dog once and they helped me. And the judge is like, what the are you talking about, you crazy person? Like, this makes no sense. So we ultimately get the other lawyer that comes on down and ultimately is like, is asking questions and stuff like that, and we have it to where we have Peter calling her kitten. Ultimately, to the point to where bizarrely, like, I don't think they had any real, true, legitimate like lines or anything like that to approach this scene. But ultimately, we have Bill that has to, or Peter that busts out into this whole thing about like, like sometimes shit happens, and who are you gonna call? And ultimately, like everybody's like, yeah, woohoo! And we have to where uh, the judge is like, excuse me, Mister Doctor Venkman. If I hear one more outburst out of you, I'm gonna hold you in contempt. And all while that's going on, we have the sludge that is all of a sudden it's bubbling, and so really we have it to where Peter is just like, well, I'm sorry, Your Honor. So we ultimately have it to where there's really no real true legitimate things for anyone to say. Like it's basically an open and shut case. Reasonably, there's no way around it. Like there's no way to not say that they weren't there, and so on and so forth. So we basically have the judge that is ultimately just kind of rendering his verdict. He's like, well, like really, when looking at this, it's like pretty shut, open and shut. It's like basically I'm gonna have to pull back from the like Salem witch trials and ultimately have you guys burned at the stake, and so on and so forth. Like this judge is basically throwing the book at them, and so on and so forth. To ultimately tell them it's like you are guilty, and like I'm gonna have you guys burn at the stake, and so on and so forth. Like you guys are con artists, and this and that, and all while this judge is really getting his judge on. Basically, we have it to where the we have to where the sludge is ultimately bubbling and bubbling up, to where even the Ghostbusters are seeing that the sludge is all of a sudden moving, and ultimately even Peter is kind of mentioning it's like, well, hey, yeah, just a little heads up, Judge. Like it seems like this slime is ultimately just just moving. Just letting you know, Judge. So the judge is like, oh, yeah, well, let me pop it. I'll reach back from a further justice and have you burned at the stake. So we ultimately have it to where the slime ends up popping and popping, where it escalates to showcase the Scaleri brothers. So we have it to where it seems that Judge knows these characters full well, ultimately seeing right out of the way that they are via electric chairs, and they're both sitting in electric chairs, but then ultimately they get out of these electric chairs because the electric chairs were as of ghosts like they were, and so ultimately they got out of this to just showcase like, hey, yeah, we were in prison once. So we have the judge going, oh crap, it's the Scaleri brothers, and so ultimately he runs like crazy because both of the ghosts were going to attack him, and so reasonably we have everybody just uh, running out of the court. Ultimately, everybody is just going crazy. We have it seemingly where the prosecutor, or the guys that aren't on the Ghostbusters side, the woman, ultimately she ends up getting flung out of the court, and so reasonably we have it where the judge is ultimately scrambling away, and we also have the Ghostbusters where their table in front of them ends up getting lifted because ultimately every single one of them were hiding underneath the table to otherwise protect themselves. But ultimately, you have the ghosts that pick up the table, so they end up running right where the judge is. So we have it to where the judge was ultimately said in the very beginning of this whole thing that reasonably we'll have no talks of spectrums or ghosts or spooks. It's like I don't want any of that because ultimately, like this this court is not going to turn into a circus and this and that. So we have it to where the judge didn't believe in ghosts and whatever and spooks and specters or whatever. So yeah, like he doesn't want any mutter about it that into his court. But reasonably, when the judge is ultimately in a s-hole position, and while he's banging on his door saying, "Help me!" It's like trying to get his door freaking open, and nobody's letting him in. And so, reasonably, we have the Ghostbusters that are going out of their way to get to where the judges were and just try to hide out. And so, ultimately, they are sticking their heads out to ultimately see what is to happen to that girl. Um, and so, ultimately, the Ghostbusters are telling them, like, well, you're next, Bubbles. Because, yeah, it's like, you're the one that caused all this, and ultimately, they're after you. And if anything, like, we can't do anything to stop them because, so ultimately, Lewis is like, yeah, that's right, because that restrainment order that I got from that girl that says we can cease and desist all activities, and so we can't do anything. And so yeah, so it's like basically you're effed. So we have to where the judge is forcibly, because ultimately the judge is forced to turn the case into the Ghostbusters' favor, so ultimately they will do their job. And so ultimately he's telling them it's like anything that they want to hear. Told me to just tell them, hey, like uh, this case is completely thrown out. It's like if anything, go ahead and do your job and get these ghosts and whatever. And so we have it to where Lewis ultimately won this case, and I bet he feels like $1 million because he didn't do jack crap nothing. And so you have the Ghostbusters that are ultimately going and throwing on their equipment, ultimately to tell us that reasonably it's been a long time since he put this equipment on, and so reasonably they have to do a bench test. So they ultimately have a tour. They ultimately start turning it on, and ultimately they go Do Re Egon as a joke. So they ultimately start having the Scaleri brothers ultimately popping themselves off to where ultimately the Ghostbusters are trying to contain the ghosts. Because ultimately at first we see just kind of chairs just kind of flipping and jumping and diving, which I thought was a really cool visual. Then eventually we have the ghost popping out to eventually scare both or all three of the Ghostbusters. Because evidently Winston is not a part of this scene, which I thought was kind of dumb. I'm like, well, why is it that we see him earlier? But whatever. Anyways, so they ultimately have it to where the Ghostbusters ultimately are like they're starting to separate. We have like Egon in one portion of the thing. We have kind of uh, Ray also in one portion of thing, and we have Peter that is trying to get the Tubby, the bigger one of the ghosts, all by himself. So it seems like what they're trying to do is try to get uh, like have one person get one ghost and have one person get the other, and then bring them both together and to get them into one trap. So we ultimately have some point have the thinner of the two ghosts almost attack Ray, but ultimately Egon lets him know, hey, behind you, Ray, and ultimately Ray ducks. So we really have it to where ultimately we have it to where again Peter is back retrieving the ghost to pull him back to where the thinner of the two Scully brothers, I'm going to mispronounce that name, and pushes both ghosts together, and then ultimately pushes both ghosts into uh, one trap, because ultimately we have Ray, or we have Peter, blah, 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 blah. We have Egon, who is setting up the trap, and ultimately both Ray and Peter are getting the ghosts together to be two in the box. There you go. We be fast and they be slow. Wow. So ultimately to tell us that the Ghostbusters are back in business, and so reasonably we have uh, a the Ghostbusters kind of kicking out onto uh, to the people, to the press, and whatever, to tell them it's like, hey, like we did it, like hey guys, like to the beautiful, to the lovely, the Ghostbusters, and so on and so forth. Basically telling us like they got 100% like they're back in business, and ultimately they were able to go and do as much ghost busting as they want to do. Basically having a quick montage of all the stuff that they are going to do. You have the even commercials kind of being popped out. Um, hot beverage mug and free balloons to the kids and so on and so forth. You have the assistant of the mayor that ultimately is just kind of like shoving his head into his desk and just like, oh my god, and so on and so forth. So it seems like everything is going fine, right? It seems like everything is quasi seemingly going at some point fine. But then eventually we have it to where ultimately we have it seemingly in some portion of this movie where Vigo needs a baby. He needs that sweet, delicious baby. So we have it at some point where ultimately we have Dana who had fed her baby, and so it seems that her baby had gotten more food on him than in him, I guess. And so ultimately that is queuing up the shower or queuing up the bath. So we have it to where reasonably Dana is having a baby is having a bath for her baby, and ultimately that water doesn't turn into water, it turns into sludge. And so eventually it seems that this sludge eventually turns into some monster that wants to eat her baby. And we also have Dana, who is also simply going to take off her shirt as well. So, all while Dana is getting her baby prepped to go to the going to the bath. Good God. We have to where ultimately uh, Dana goes into having her kid go into the bathroom, but then realizes there's a monster in her bath. So ultimately, she runs away to ultimately go and see Peter. And so, reasonably, and I think there's a moment of which that I am missing here, because I think that there is a point of which that I need to make at some point. Because I do remember that ultimately Peter had went to see Dana. Um, yeah, and they did the whole like Peter had mentioned that Vigo is craving a cat, and ultimately like Peter wanted to kind of paint a cat into the picture and this and that. Uh, Peter ends up trying to go and see Dana while she works to see what she does, and ultimately kind of is trying to make as much fun of Janish as possible, and ultimately is kind of making fun of the painting and stuff like that. But ultimately, Dana is mentioning that. Like, hey, could you check on this painting? Like every once in a while, I think that this painting is looking at me and winking at me, and like it's really making me uncomfortable. And that's when Peter is otherwise saying like, oh, okay, well, we'll check it out. Um, So hence why eventually when they have the bathtub that attacks Dana, we have it to where Dana ultimately makes her way to Peter's place, ultimately to have her kind of crazily just talking about like I was giving Oscar a bath and it tried to eat him and oh my god, like ultimately just yelling and screaming and stuff like that to ultimately Ray is crazily calling, or Peter is crazily calling Ray to get over uh, to check out Dana's apartment to see what the heck is going on there. And so Ray ultimately gets the call and he's like, "So what?" It's like, "Oh my god." And so recently you have it to where Egon and Ray have gotten pretty decent amount of samples of this mood slime, and ultimately we have earlier in the film where ultimately when Ray collects the mood slime, uh, they're ultimately kind of like testing what it does. Um, ultimately, at some point, putting the mood slime into a toaster and ultimately seeing the toaster dance around to Jackie Williams. Um, ultimately, to have Peter mention, like, oh, that's my Christmas boutique item. Oh, I'm gonna sell this. I'm gonna have people get all this and that, and to where ultimately uh, and supposedly it makes toast as well too. Anyways, there's so much about this movie I desperately need to just push on. There's so much crap to mention everywhere, everything. There's so many things to mention. But anyways, uh, yeah. So we have to where Ray is ultimately is ultimately talking about them needing a much more uh, like to check out Dana's apartment, but then eventually uh, they need a much more like check out the Vigo and check out eventually the check out everything. Just check out all kinds of stuff. So pushing on into eventually them checking out the Vigo painting. Ultimately, for Peter to mention sucking the guts boys were Ghostbusters, and Torianish is like, "Oh my god, hey yeah!" Like, to ultimately Ray is ultimately going to be the guy to sick him. Like that, Yanish is gonna that Ray is gonna have to be blocking Yanish to get them away from him. While ultimately they can test and do all the kinds of stuff that they need to do, and so on and so forth. It seems that Peter is going to be taking numerous pictures of Vigo. It seems that Ray is going to be doing his devices and trying to scan Vigo, but eventually it seems like he gets lost in Vigo's eyes, and we ultimately have it to where Egon is doing some testing and so on and so forth, and you have Winston that is ultimately mentioning like one ugly dude ultimately looking at Vigo, and we have it to where Peter's like, no, that's Vigo, he's big. So we ultimately have it to where Janish is like, no, like, don't take any pictures, please. We have signed uh, we have signed things often in the gift shop. Like don't and like don't take pictures of the photograph. So we have it to where ultimately Giannis is ultimately getting shoved off, and so Peter is being able to take his photos. So ultimately we have it to where Peter is trying to get Vigo the painting as aggravated as possible by like telling him it's uh like give me hot and sexy. Like, oh no, give me angry, give me mad, like give me more. Oh, you're scaring me, stop it. Like, yeah, yeah. like he's like really trying to tick off this painting that ultimately this painting is just like so we have to where Ray is staring off into this Vigo's eyes, and ultimately to the point of him like dropping his device or dropping whatever he was doing, and so we have it uh, to where Egon is ultimately pulling Peter off to the side because it's like okay, like I think we need to like I think we need to talk. So we have it to where uh, Peter looks to Vigo and is like, "Well, like I've not worked with many, but whatever." So we have Peter pushing on, and so we have it to where uh, Winston is ultimately having to bump to wake up Ray. It's like, hey man, uh, they're like, hey, what's going on? And Ray's like, oh, hey, yeah, I'm just finishing up. And Winston's ultimately like, well, you're not coming down with something, are you? And Ray's like, me? No, I'm fine. Because ultimately he was just staring into that painting like it was nobody's business. So we have it to where that moment is now over. And because ultimately we have because I think at some point we get a little bit of backstory in this scene. Ultimately, we talk about Janusz being an immigrant, and that ultimately he's like made his way to America and this and that, and uh, and so we kind of get a little bit of backstory about Janusz. So within the scene, kind of giving us some interesting journeys because ultimately uh, this and that and whatever what have you. Anyways, pushing on. So we because we just got to keep on pushing. It's an hour and 12 minutes. Holy crap. So pushing on now. So we have it to where they have developed this film, and it seems like they are putting this film through the ringer, trying to uh, eventually have Peter and Ray eventually finding out within this within with blah, 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 finding out within this photos that they're making that they are finding some weird and or interesting images, finding out that it seems that there is a painting behind this painting, and we find out that there is Vigo's head, and he is in a river of slime. So ultimately, Ray is telling us, it's like, well, hey, like, when you guys had me dangling on a hook with, uh, 12 feet underneath the surface, whatever, that's what I saw. I saw a river of slime. So ultimately, we find out that ultimately, bizarrely, all these paintings start, or all these photos start to burn up, and you have it to where Winston has to come in and break down the door to ultimately fire extinguish all these photos off. So ultimately, pushing them more and more to want to go down and ultimately eventually see within the sewer this river of slime so that way they can get some better samples or ultimately like see uh, like how deep the river of slime really goes. So we ultimately have it to where Peter is ultimately eventually getting to the point of having to take care of Dana and Oscar at his place. Uh, at some points, we have it to where uh, we have Peter that is going to have to forcibly have to give away his Joe Willie Namath sweater to Oscar to try to use as a quasi diaper. Um, because Oscar doesn't have anything. But then eventually, when Peter eventually comes back to his apartment, he finds out that Dana had cleaned. Like, oh, she cleaned. And so, reasonably, we have it to where ultimately uh, Peter, when seeing what Dana has done to his apartment, ultimately we have Dana who is sleeping with her baby because reasonably Dana or we have Dana who is going to sleep with her baby, and Peter is just going to sleep on the couch. Because ultimately, at first they were going to have the bedding arrangements where ultimately Peter was just thinking about him sleeping with uh, her and how basically uh, she was going to sleep one way and ultimately he was going to sleep right behind her and get uh, hair caught in his throat and ultimately choke in the night. But eventually Dana comes with the consensus of like, well, I really don't want to put him down, and ultimately, how about like me and Oscar just share this bed, and ultimately you can get the couch, and ultimately, like Peter was fine with that, and he's like, well, it's like Peter was like, well, how about I put him down? It's like, well, you're a terrible burden on your poor mother, and and this and that, and so that way ultimately that pushes them to eventually go into Janish's place in the morning to ultimately look up so on and so forth and do the whole painting photo thing where ultimately they talk about Vigo the Carpathian, the ultimately telling us that at some point before his head died, that ultimately he was telling people, it's like, well, death is but a door in or wait, something about a window and a door. Uh, God, what was it? What was the line? I know it. Uh, time is but a or death is but a door, and if time is but a door and death is but a window, I'll be back, or something like that. Um, ultimately, to tell us that ultimately this guy is a magician of sorts, and ultimately some kind of wizard or magic user of sorts, and so ultimately, uh, like this guy was killed over and over again numerous times, like shot, hung, any kind of thing that you could possibly die from, poisoned, and so on and so forth. Like this guy could not die. To just tell us that eventually, if time is but a window and death is but a door, he'll be back, and so on and so forth. So, pushing us on to eventually have it to where going way further on in this movie, we have Ray, Egon, and Winston going into the sewer. They ultimately had called Peter, "Hey, do you want to be? You want to go to the sewer and check out some rats and stuff like that?" And ultimately, Peter's like, "No. Like, if anything, I'm gonna go and go on a date with Dana." And while while that is going on, we ultimately have it to where Lewis and Janine from Peter's staff is watching is going to watch Oscar, because reasonably, while ultimately we find out that Dana had cleaned, we have it to where Peter is making arrangements for uh, for Dana to go on a date with him and to have all the cheap moves, but to ultimately have Janine be her babysitter, Janine from his staff. So, pushing on, we have it uh, to where reasonably uh, Peter and Peter and Dana are going on this date, and reasonably you have it to where uh, they're talking about their old times, and ultimately, when once before they're ultimately talking about, or ultimately Peter had mentioned what he wanted from the relationship, that he wanted to be loved, he wanted to be desired, and ultimately Dana had hit him with like, well, it's when you called me the old ball and chain, that's when I left. And that's ultimately when Peter would go into talking about uh, getting or only being really concerned and pushing to be better at his job, and that's where ultimately he talks to Egon and says like, well, what are we doing? And ultimately telling Oscar that he was named after a hot dog. You poor man, you poor man. As right before they were going to get his stool sample, and ultimately Peter pushes the stool sample on Dana to try to get his stool sample. Anyways, pushing on. So we ultimately have to where Peter is ultimately mentioning that, like, you know what, if you could give me a jingle in the like ultimately if you could just like give me time, like ultimately I will like I'll be everything that you want me to be. Like if anything, I just need more time. And so ultimately we have it to where Dana's like mentioning, it's like, well, how about I give you a jingle in the year 2000? And ultimately you have it to where Peter is mentioning, it's like, well, hey, how about I give you a jingle right now? So we ultimately have it to where Ray and Egon and Winston are making their way into this restaurante, and ultimately they are covered with slime. Because what had happened was, is they made their way onto this journey through this sewer, and ultimately we have a very interesting moment where at first they were kind of mentioning whether or not to bring the packs or not, and so reasonably you have it to where they are talking about like the main problem is either beavers or rats or something like that in the sewer, ultimately trying to freak out Winston, who didn't even want to be in this sewer anyways. And so we have it to where they are making their way through this sewer, and all of a sudden they are hearing some stuff. They are hearing some things. We ultimately have it to where ultimately I gotta switch here. I gotta transition. My fingers. Anyways, so we have it to where reasonably they are starting to see some things, some heads on pikes, and all of a sudden, because reasonably what ends up happening is they end up shouting out their names, or they kind of just shout out like stuff and things, like they start shouting out, "Hey, hey, hey, hey," as they like hear an echo, and eventually Winston gets to the point of hello, and ultimately you have a bellowing sound that goes Winston, and then all of a sudden you see the heads on spikes where they all start to freak out, and to where eventually you have it to where Winston turns around and Egon and Ray just run off, and Winston ends up almost getting hit with a ghost train that ultimately ends up just not killing him, luckily. Uh, because sadly enough, he's the best Ghostbuster out of all this thing. To have Winston being lost would have just been horrible. So ultimately, after Winston ends up getting hit by this ghost train, ultimately we have Egon telling him exactly what this train was. Like, I think it was coming out of Central Albany or some other thing. It was some kind of ghost train. Like, but I can't be sure about that. Did you catch the number of the locomotive? And Winston's like, sorry, I missed it by getting hit by it. I was too freaking scared to remember what the number of the train was. Are you freaking kidding me? So we have it to where ultimately we have Ray who ended up finding out where it was that he uh, had uh, had been dropped off from the earlier portion of the movie, and so ultimately he's like, "Hey, I found where the path is," and to where all the other Ghostbusters are like, "Oh, great, let's go further on into this," and Winston's like, "Are you sure? Like, do you think we should probably get the packs? like what about the packs?" So they go further on into the slime and or sludge to find out that there is a river of slime, and so ultimately what they end up doing is they end up realistically they end up going in this bad boy, and what ends up happening is they test for how deep the thing is, and so ultimately we have it to where this thing keeps going further and further along, and it's like, well, 12 feet. We're like, hey, whoa, what's going on? It's like, well, something's pulling it. And so we have to where eventually we have it to where one of the guys and we have Winston end up being shoved into the river of slime. To ultimately, Ray and Egon are ending up like going like, well, if he's going, we're going along with him because like ultimately we're all gonna have to experience this all together. Forcibly ending up them we have Egon and Ray both diving in after Winston to of course save the most important Ghostbuster this whole Ghostbuster movie, because ultimately he's got to give some crap to the mayor at some point again, because that's what he's good for. He's good at giving people crap. It's great. So we have it to where Winston is just like screaming and yelling like, ah! It sucks. It just sucks. So anyways, we eventually have it to where they eventually come out of some manhole, and ultimately they are fighting one another. Because ultimately this is mood slime, and evidently this is putting them in a horrible mood. So we really have it to where like Winston is blaming Ray for mistakes, and Ray is blaming Winston, and so on and so forth, to where they're coming to blows, and reasonably like Egon is saying, wait, take off your clothes. And so we have it to where Ray and Winston stop thinking and start taking off their clothes. Take your stuff off. So we have it to where they're taking off all their clothes, and ultimately we have Winston was like, "Oh my God, I was almost willing to kill you," and ultimately Ray is like, "It's the stuff. It's all concentrated evil. It's all coming from this place." And they turn around, and it's from the place where Yanish was. So pushing on even more so to the point of reasonably and irrationally, we have to where while Janine and Lewis are ultimately going in on like basically getting busy with one another, because ultimately Lewis is talking about that at some point had gotten or he had a roommate, but his mother moved to Florida, so on and so forth. We ultimately have Janish, who is talking to Vigo, the Carpathian, and ultimately mentioning at some point that Vigo is mentioning that he is that it's the season of evil, and that ultimately pushing on into, like I've said these lines probably hundreds and hundreds of times on other videos and so on and so forth. We have it to where ultimately uh, Vigo is of course mentioning about like that we of course need to get the baby, and so recently it's pushing on to that point of like, okay, we need to grab this kid, and so we recently have it to where while Janine and Lewis are just kind of getting busy. We have it to where ultimately a ghost is getting busy trying to steal this baby. So we ultimately have it to where the Ghostbusters are ultimately now from out of the sewer and crazily going to try to find Peter to ultimately tell Dana that yeah, your job is the center of wherever this slime is, because ultimately uh, they went for a swim in it and they almost killed each other, and so on and so forth. And so reasonably we have it to where Ray is poking out exact or pointing to where exactly the facility is, her ultimately Data's museum, and ultimately he flings some slime, and ultimately we have one of the other diners, like one of the other women that are at the dining restaurant, is will be like, "Oh my god, he got this all over me!" And so, recently, because the Ghostbusters make their way into this restaurant without a real reservation, it seems that the police are ultimately going to arrest them because they can. So we have it to where ultimately pushing on to again the Ghostbusters being arrested, and so reasonably we have it to where Bobby Brown is ultimately uh, having them be arrested, and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where the Ghostbusters are trying to desperately talk to the mayor's assistant, and ultimately talking about like, hey, it's hot and it's ready to pop. It's like reasonably, it's like uh, Winston is talking about like, or like all these guys are talking about like that. Ultimately, if this assistant person isn't willing to hear them out, that ultimately they're going to go for they're ultimately going to go to the press for this, and ultimately they are going to like slime square, yeah, like what would be the best headline for this? Ultimately, we have it to where the mayor's assistant is ultimately just like, well, there's one way to really resolve all this is to basically just commit them, say that they're all crazy, make them all go to the loony bin. And so recently, the mayor's assistant has them all be sent away, ultimately in straitjackets, and ultimately you have it to where uh, we have Bill Murray's brother that is ultimately going to be this therapist that ultimately is going to talk to all the Ghostbusters, and you have it to where uh, Peter is ultimately saying it's like, well, I think that these guys are all crazy. Like I don't believe a single thing that any of them are saying, and uh, basically Ray and Egon and is trying to like mention like some of the stuff that happened within this movie to where ultimately uh, that like Winston mentions like, well, there's a tub that almost ate a baby and stuff like that, and like, and the therapist is like, so what? It's like, and so they're trying to explain the mood slime and all this kinds of stuff, and they're trying to explain all these things, and they talked about that they made a toaster dance and all kinds of things, and to where ultimately Bill Murray's just like, well, like Peter's just like, well, they're crazy. I don't know what they're talking about. Like trying to like get out of all this. So reasonably, we have it to where Dana is trying to make it back to her apartment. Ultimately, talking about that reasonably, the date didn't go as well because ultimately Peter had gotten arrested. It's like, and we have Janine that's like, oh well, typical. So ultimately, Dana's asking, well, did he call? And he's like, well, no. So we have it to where Dana is making her way to the baby, and eventually she's realizing that her baby is not in the room, and ultimately she is looking out of her window to where the baby is just crawling outside of the apartment, where it's like, oh my god. And so Dana is trying to make her way out to the baby, and we have it to where the ghost ends up, that looks like Yanish, is seemingly grabbing the baby and taking the baby along and away and whatever, and to where ultimately Dana has to go, of course, to the museum because like, she knows full well that Janish had took her baby, and ultimately, that's when Lewis is ultimately saying like, we need to get the guys, like we need to stop this. So ultimately, pushing on to the fact that all heck is breaking loose after this baby gets to this museum. Basically, we have this jello mold or whatever, this slime mold that is being put onto this entire uh, seemingly museum, especially after Dana gets there. And so eventually we have it to where this town is going bonkers, going wild, going crazy. Because ultimately, what ends up happening is the slime is seemingly arising from the sewers to ultimately just get on to everywhere and start really just attacking people, because ultimately New York is just the most angry and or aggressive place. Excuse me. Because reasonably we have it to where the Ghostbusters are trying to convince the mayor about things to ultimately like, and the mayor is like, well, you have 2 minutes. So the Ghostbusters are trying to convince the mayor that ultimately it's like, well, like, hey man, like we're here, and like we ultimately went for a swim in it, and we ultimately went on killing each other and whatever. And so we have it to where Peter is trying to convince the mayor. It's like, hey, well, like we voted for you in the last election, like 2 out of the 4 of us. So that's when, of course, the mayor's assistant has them committed, and so eventually, all of a sudden, the Ghostbusters are, of course, committed. They're crazy, and so reasonably, we have it to where now the town is all going to, and so reasonably, we have it to where nobody is really there to be able to take this thing out, and so reasonably, we have it to where we have meter maids chasing ghosts all over town. We ultimately see fur coats all of a sudden come back alive again and attack the person that is wearing it, and so on and so forth. There's so many ghosts all over town, and it's crazy. We have this giant ghost that is kind of tailoring all around the city, and so on and so forth. All this craziness is going on. It's amazing. We ultimately have Titanic back in town, and ultimately we have the guy who's from Cheech and Chong that was like, well, it's better late than never. and so on and so forth. All heck is breaking loose, so on and so forth. And so reasonably, you have it to where uh, we have to where the mayor is uh, hearing all these reports, and ultimately he's looking outside of his window, and he's just kind of seeing like the worst looking sky that he's ever seen. He's like, "Somebody get me the Ghostbusters!" So ultimately, we have it to where forcibly we have it to where the mayor is ultimately talking to his assistant. It's like, well, like I did what you suggested. I had them committed, and ultimately the mayor's like I didn't want him to go that. I didn't want you to go that far, and ultimately telling him that he's fired and everything like that. And he's like, wait, what? What is? It? Yeah, he's fired. So the mayor is asking to get him the Ghostbusters. 'Cause ultimately, he desperately needs them, and so we have it to where the Ghostbusters are all getting their gear, and Lewis is telling the Ghostbusters the whole breakdown of what all has gone on by the time that they were gone. Ultimately, to that the baby is now gone, that Dana's baby is gone, and so ultimately Ray is breaking down. It's like, well, Vigo needs a baby to inhabit, and so Oscar must be it, and so on and so forth. Ba 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 ba. So we have it to where the Ghostbusters need to go out of their way to eventually uh, find a way to get into this museum, and so ultimately they are trying to break their way in. Try to break way in using their, of course, proton packs. So we have it to where also Dana is trying to get her baby, and ultimately she cannot. To ultimately she tries to sneak in there, ultimately to grab her child, to ultimately have her child flying out of her hands to be put back where it was, and Dana to be slung back into some caged up area. And because ultimately she tries to seduce Janish, to ultimately mention uh, that she could learn to be Vigo's mother. Because ultimately, uh, Janish is mentioning about all the great advantages to be uh, the mother of the living God, free parking, and so on and so forth. And so we have to where ultimately Dana is like saying, "Well, I could learn." Ultimately, to just kind of like say whatever Janish thinks that he needs to hear, so that way she can get her baby, which ultimately will blow up in her face. Because eventually she will eventually get seemingly hogtied into some uh, some some she'll be roped up into uh, some kind of I want to call it like it doesn't matter. She gets roped up to ultimately be stuck. To ultimately the Ghostbusters is going to try to release her out of it, but that comes later. So, anyways, we have it to where the Ghostbusters are ultimately trying to proton pack their way into getting into this museum, and it's not working. So ultimately, they're easily and quickly just giving up. They're like, God, there's no way for us to just get enough morale and get enough goodwill into everybody to just like. There's no way like this city has gotten so bad lately that like there's no way back. It's polluted, it's crowded, it's blah blah blah. Like everybody would just assume step on your face then look at you and so on. Like they're like, what are we gonna do? It's like, come on, there's got to be some goodwill left in this burned out bird. Like, what are we gonna do? And so ultimately, like we have it to where everybody's looking at the license plate of the Ecto One and they're like, well, I think we got something. So we have it to where they ultimately are going to the Statue of Liberty, ultimately asking if she's really naked under that toga. So they ultimately get the Statue of Liberty and they slime the living crap out of it. And so then ultimately they are getting set to ultimately seeming loudspeakers. They're ultimately going to they're basically going to turn this Statue of Liberty into one big giant toaster. So, but ultimately, it seems like they're going to have much more control of this toaster. They're going to be able to have some kind of device of sorts, some kind of Nintendo-esque like controller to seemingly adjust where this Statue of Liberty is going to go. So we have it to where they're like, well, we're gonna hit this one for Liberty Island and sweep some New Year's sweep for you, Big Apple or whatever. So they play the song, and so all of a sudden we have the Statue of Liberty seemingly coming to life. We have the torch that was seemingly not an actual torch now turning into a torch, and so we have it to where they are trying to make their way to New York, and so ultimately, uh, none of them can really believe any of this is really going on, and so ultimately, they're making their way to the city, and so ultimately now they're kind of making their way as fast as they can to the museum. Told me have some goodwill going, but also we have it to where, hey, can she move any faster? It's like, well, we didn't pat at her feet or something like that. So it will ultimately have them accidentally crushing a police car with the Statue of Liberty's feet, and it's like, oh, sorry, my fault. So pushing on, we have it to where ultimately uh, the Ghostbusters make their way all the way to the museum. You have it to where the Statue of Liberty arm ends up crushing into the museum. Ultimately, the Ghostbusters was like, "Well, hey, yeah, like do it, you can do it, yeah." Like Statue of Liberty, crush this bad boy. Um, so we have it to where ultimately Janish is looking and ultimately noticing that there is some slime that is seemingly being relieved off of the top of the this building to ultimately notice that he sees the Statue of Liberty. He's like, oh no, oh no. So, because ultimately, uh, Janish's big thing is that, oh, like 12 minutes to party time. And so ultimately, it seems like they're having their New Year's spectacular, uh, but Dana's only out to get her son, which ultimately will not work out. So we have to where the Ghostbusters end up similarly roping their way into this environment, and we have it to where seemingly Vigo is not in the painting. So we ultimately have it to where eventually Dana eventually ends up getting roped up, and ultimately uh, the guys end up having to forcibly try to free her, and ultimately end up getting uh, to where they try to have uh, like they ultimately try to blast Vigo, and that doesn't exactly work. It seems like all the Ghostbusters end up getting knocked back, and ultimately they're desperately hoping that eventually they're going to get some goodwill or something to really channel them to be able to have everything work out. So it seems that eventually they end up having to get get the baby because ultimately Dana tries to retrieve the baby, and ultimately we have it to where Peter ends up taking the baby to a rest stop to ultimately Peter can make sure that ultimately the baby's taken care of, and ultimately he's gonna mention to the baby, it's like, well, hey, I'm like Uncle Pete's gonna go and rescue your mom. Ultimately, her mom, ultimately Oscar's mom was tied up, so we have it to where ultimately, like I said, the Ghostbusters end up blasting with their proton packs, but that does nothing, and they end up getting knocked over. We have it to where ultimately Vigo is making his way to the baby, and ultimately Dana is desperately asking, like, do something! To where Peter's just like, hey, you! Hey, you with the the taco pal, you, whatever. Did they told you that the broad shoulder look is out? Ultimately, saying whatever he can to take him off. Uh, ultimately, telling you are one. You have one big melon on top of that head, but like you have made one huge mistake. God, this is so much coming from memory. Um, like that ultimately he could have been anywhere, like, but he should have been in the San Fernando Valley or something. Um, and so we have it to where Vigo is ultimately getting ticked off, and so ultimately he releases some pain to go all over the Ghostbusters. To ultimately Peter is like, oh darn it! To ultimately, like, Egon is writhing in pain, and to eventually we have it to where ultimately Vigo ends up going and getting the baby, and ultimately telling them, Vigo is telling the baby it's like now we'll become one, but ultimately the baby is ultimately screaming and yelling, and we have it to where ultimately we hear in the very hint of background that everybody is singing, because ultimately it's New Year's, it's midnight, and ultimately they're going and singing all the greatest we forgot and never brought to mind. Ba 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 ba. Everybody's singing in unison, all everybody's hugging because it's New Year's, and ultimately we find out that the good chair of everyone singing, because ultimately they're asking, it's like, hey, where's that singing coming from? Because ultimately it's like, hey man, it's New Year's. It's like freaking, it's weakening him, and so ultimately we have it to where Oscar is seemingly slowly but surely loosening the arms are loosening of Vigo to where almost he's dropping Oscar, and so Dana is desperately trying to see if she can catch Oscar before Vigo drops him. But ultimately, we have it to where Peter seemingly comes to Oscar's aid, catches the baby, and ultimately Dana ends up trying to desperately make her way to the baby, and to where ultimately Peter's telling her, it's like, hey, like find a shielded spot or go somewhere. So we have it to where ultimately Vigo, considering how weakened he is, has made his way back into the painting. To where, of course, Egon has to mention that he's back into the painting, and so reasonably we have it to where ultimately uh, Vigo is going to make one desperate attempt to look at Ray, and ultimately to look at him so much to where Ray is looking into Vigo's eyes, and to ultimately where Ray is completely in front of the painting, to ultimately we have the other guys that are like, hey Ray, you're in front of the painting, we'd love for you to move so we can shoot the monster, please. Ray, and then we'll ultimately find out that Ray has been possessed by Vigo, and ultimately he's gonna be like, yeah, Ray's an imbecile, and so on and so forth, to where we find out that Peter's just like now, and so we have it to where Ray just gets blasted with slime. Ultimately, Ray gets separated from Vigo, and Vigo goes back to the painting. And ultimately, they just repetitiously keep blasting the painting until ultimately the painting just explodes and everybody just rushes off. So we have it to where ultimately the the guys wake up uh, from either being slimed or otherwise just kind of waking up from this explosion. We ultimately have it uh, to where they wake up Ray, who ultimately he ultimately is kind of in different spirits. He's hit with a crap ton of positive mood slime, so ultimately he's feeling very cheery. Ultimately that telling the guys, he's like, "Oh, I love all you guys. I love Venkman. Wow, real friendship." And ultimately, they are picking up Janish, who ultimately is again with really good spirits, and ultimately, like, Ray is telling Janish that he loves him, and he's like, "Oh, I love you too." So reasonably, we have it to where pushing on uh, to where we find that the painting is completely different than what it was originally. We find out that the painting has the baby in it and all the Ghostbusters, and ultimately they're kind of debating who the artist was and everything like that. And so, reasonably, the whole thing ends with them just kind of going out of the museum, just saying, "Hey guys, we won! Isn't that great?" And like everybody's just like having a party and everything out there, and they're all celebrating and whatever. So yeah, celebrating. It's all great. Woohoo! Yeah, but I gotta get out of here. Ultimately, yeah, even kind of skipping over the whole fact of Lewis Tully needing to be a Ghostbuster at some point. That ultimately he was going to try and break down the museum, but ultimately he couldn't, or ultimately he did at the very last second. And he seemingly got the credit for that, but it really wasn't him. It was actually the Ghostbusters. But meh. Uh, because ultimately, like, we have Lewis was like, "I did it, I'm a Ghostbuster," but he didn't do jack crap, nothing. But anyways, ultimately, it was kind of funny for Lewis to try to be a Ghostbuster, ultimately to wear Spangler's outfit and to run around and to make good decisions and, and this and that. And we ultimately have Lewis going into the Slimer bus and ultimately having to do that, which I thought was funny. So, pushing us on, yeah, I think that's all I need to talk about kind of quickly and wrap this whole thing up. And just what a good movie. I enjoy it. Every once in a while, I'll go back to it if I have time. Reasonably, I haven't seen this movie in years. I kind of just like I've seen it too often, and I pretty much know everything about it. Like, yeah, I probably didn't remember a lot of the lines. I just kind of wanted to skip through a lot of stuff. But then ultimately, I just went and backpedaled anyways because I'm like, yeah, I guess I should mention all this stuff because otherwise I'm gonna feel horrible about it that I didn't mention everything. Um, but at the end of the day, I think that's all I wanted to say about Ghostbusters 2. There's probably a number of things that I could have said and could have mentioned all kinds of lines and stuff like that, but I just didn't want to spend 2 hours talking about it, but I ended up doing that anyways. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.